All right, we are live.
Woo, live. Confetti, insert confetti here.
Hey there, everyone. Thanks for joining another Seattle Data Guy Live. Today we've got Ajay here from Code Emporium. So if no one has ever gone to Code Emporium, which I feel like a lot of people have, are you at 100,000 subscribers yet?
No, you're probably going to rub it in my face. No,
I mean, I'm not at it either, so
I'm at like 83 or something.
Oh, so close.
Eventually, hopefully this year. I don't know.
You gotta start posting more on LinkedIn. That seems to work.
LinkedIn, huh? Yeah, maybe I'll just like change my strategy. It's like, yeah, YouTube is clearly not doing it for me.
Oh no, I more mean like you got to start doing like 10 great videos on Transformers.
Oh my gosh. I am the Transformer guy, aren't I? That's great.
I mean, aren't those your most popular videos?
Those are my most popular videos.
For anyone who doesn't know, if you want to actually understand how a lot of the stuff in machine learning works, or how the same things with neural networks, whether it's transformers, reward kind of models, and things of that nature, Code Emporium is where to go. He has everything on that space. And recently, I think I saw you made a few videos on ChatGPT. So obviously, we have to ask the most important question, which is ChatGPT going to replace my job?
ChatGPT going to replace your job? I think. Well, I love how when we like the spread of AI is just, it's so funny because like for the last like few years, at least the better part of a half decade, we've always made incremental changes and leaps in language models in general. And it's just like this one little leap that happens and boom, now everybody knows about it. And I was like, wow, okay. So now everybody knows about it, but not like the 20 other like leaps that happened just before this. Very interesting, but okay. ChatGPT, I don't know if it's going to take your job at all. It's only going to like, I mean, I would say it's a great supplement to most jobs out there. It's great to just, it'll be a great tool as like a supplementary thing to help you do your job probably more efficiently and better, especially some of the more menial tasks. It's a great chatbot for assistance, sure, in that regard too. But for the most part, I think like a lot of jobs are still here to stay. I have to speak very generally. There are definitely some jobs that are kind of at risk if it's like more very menial, I don't know, just like data entry kind of jobs. Maybe some call center help jobs at least will be going down, but they've been kind of going down over the years because of better AI assistance in general. But yeah, I do think it's like, I would always refrain from catastrophizing anything until like, okay, we can, we're completely flushed out. This is like a very production ready, complete ready model. But until then, I do think that there is still hope for humanity. Let's just leave it there.
So you referenced earlier there was like 20 other leaps, and I'm sure maybe there was probably more than 20 or something like that. What do you think are like 3 or 4 other ones that people have missed that are also kind of worth pointing out, that are just as important or more important than ChatGPT, and we're just ignoring it for one reason?
Oh yeah, definitely. So it was, of course, like probably the landmark paper of 2017, which was "Attention is All You Need." That was kind of the paper that introduced the architecture of transformer neural networks. And transformer neural networks was actually built on top of another probably previous idea of attention, where we're just going to be like, hey, let's pay attention to different parts of an input and try to generate an output based on those different parts, right? And that's why transformers, essentially, like, it's a very fancy schmancy name. And if you look at like the architectures in the paper, it looks super complicated, but basically they're just big attention units that just perform attention. And that's about it. So I would say like, that's essentially a very huge leap, because it replaced a previously used architecture called recurrent neural networks for sequence to sequence tasks, which is basically, sequences are like, if inputs have an ordered set of tokens, it's a sequence, kind of like sentences, they are sequences. So like if you're doing like text translation, right? You input an English sentence, you get a French sentence. Transformers do that better, like out of the box, straight out, right? So again, I think I mentioned like 3 leaps in that little thing, I guess, in terms of like, okay, these are like some big things to take care of. And then after that was like the introduction of probably the idea of pre-training. So in machine learning, there's a really big concept called transfer learning that we all want to take advantage of, where it's like, we need way too much data to train all of these big models of like millions and millions of parameters. And so in order to do that, how do you do that much cheaper? Well, take a model that is already very close to what you need, and then just introduce like some more data to it so that you can fine tune it a little bit. And so the idea of using like pre-trained models, that came like slightly later. I believe it was in like, we call it generative pre-trained transformers, or the first version of GPT that we saw, as well as in parallel, there was BERT,
Oh, yes.
all these fun Sesame Street character names, there was like BERT, there was Elmo. It's really funny. Yeah. And then we just take it from there. There was like a few more leaps there. And then now we have like ChatGPT, and boom, now the world knows.
That's funny because when I first started in the data world, back when I was a youngin, like recurrent neural networks were like the shit. Like everyone's like RNN, like recurrent neural networks, RNNs, like this is how you build one in 15 minutes on your lunch break. That was like every other Medium article.
Yeah.
It's like this one's in PyTorch, this one's in TensorFlow. Someone referenced I think it's Theano the other day, and I'm like, oh my god, I do remember Theano. That
old.
Right? Like it's like
So
that's
old.
old, but it's old, and you're just like, I am old now, like so yeah, it's interesting, just like all that stuff is basically garbage knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, it was useful
useful. Yes.
It's still useful. Or it's like complete garbage. I mean, no offense to like any of your viewers who are using Theano. You are wonderful people, and I think Mr. Seattle Data Guy loves you very much, and as do I.
No, I more just mean it's like it's similar to like I mean, I don't know how much you come into the like data engineering infrastructure, but like the Hadoop era, where like everyone's like, this is the stuff, like this is everything, and then eventually people are like, never mind, let's not make our lives really complicated, let's use SQL again, and not do MapReduce. So I imagine it's kind of that similar shift. So yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. Like in terms of ChatGPT, like what makes it is there anything about it that makes it like specifically unique and like so good at what it does, or at least maybe not so good, but like going to be so good at what it does?
Oh yeah, definitely. That's actually a really good question, because I think it's a good opportunity to outline the difference between GPT and Chat GPT. Like we've had let's say over time, I mentioned just now about like, the idea of transfer learning and using like a model that already knows stuff, right? And then just like fine tuning it with a little more data. That's how we got BERT and then GPT-1, the original GPT. So the thing is that these are just on their own. They're like language models. They are the ones that are responsible for like at the core generating like, people who are using ChatGPT, right? You will give a question, it'll give an answer to that question. Learning how to do that at its core is what GPT does for the best, right? At its core. But what makes ChatGPT really interesting is because it also has other parts to it. So if I were to say, let's say ChatGPT is a car, GPT is the engine. So the engine is probably the most important part of the car, but the car has other components to it too. One of those other components is a very important component, and that's the concept of using reinforcement learning in this entire scenario. So I think what ChatGPT, when it came out in like December, right, or end of November, beginning of December, what it really prided itself on, at least the way I saw it, was like, oh, this chatbot will really answer your questions like to your point, and it'll answer it with like factualness and also non-toxicity, right? It's like non-toxic responses, factual responses, very kind of politically correct in some ways. Yes, those that notion of introducing like, answering your questions to whatever you asked, also factual and non-toxicity, that can actually be attributed more to the reinforcement learning aspect to it. And in reinforcement learning, we create something called a rewards model. So what this is like, in reinforcement learning, it's like, okay, it's like a carrot and stick approach to learning to do any kind of task, right? If you do good, then you're rewarded with like a positive reward. If you do bad, you're punished. And in ChatGPT's case, it's like, all right, so we have this, let's now take our engine, which is our GPT. It generates text for a question. That's fantastic. But now we're going to basically use reinforcement learning, where we're going to have ChatGPT generate like, I'm going to give it one question. It'll generate 4 responses to that question, or some like number of responses. And then now there's going to be a human that comes in there and is like, all right, which of these responses do I like the most? Right. And it'll rank those responses and assign numerically a reward to it. And then that information is going to be used to train this rewards model. So this rewards model, it's a separate architecture, which is going to essentially just take in like the user prompt, an example answer that ChatGPT, the GPT model, I should say, originally made. And the output is just going to be like it's like going to be a high number for a positively good reward, or it's going to be a very low number for like a bad, okay, I didn't like this, right? And then that's kind of how we have this rewards model that's basically going to say, I can assess how good an answer is to a given question.
Yeah.
And then using both of these two together, that is the original GPT architecture and this rewards model, we then come together with an entire modeled architecture that is good at answering questions with correctness as well as being non-toxic. So that's kind of like the whole TLDR of the situation, but there's definitely always these fun details that we can always go through. But yeah.
Is there any other components that you think we overlook, or is that like the main one? Because like that makes sense, because that's kind of like, why everyone's trying to constantly jailbreak GPT, right? Like they're like, all right, how do I get it to like write a poem about how awesome Hitler was or something like, completely whatever ridiculous. So are there other components that you really think are worth pointing out?
Yep. So that's definitely one of them. Like this jailbreak, that's so funny. Yeah, because like I feel like whenever humans try to test anything, it's always like, let's try to see how to mess shit up. That's what we got to do. It's like it's so funny because even in if you look at GPT-4's release, right? You look at the main paper and they basically released a paper, right? It's not even a real paper, but it's like a paper. It's like 100 pages long. And if you look at that, it's like all of it is just like, how do we deal with like strange like anti-Semitic things that people might type, or just like nuances, right? All of it is just like, okay. There's like, of course, a good part of it is like, okay, how good it is in exams. But a lot of it is like, okay, let's make sure that we're being very safe, because AI safety, which is in its own separate field, is super important. But to answer your question, so what other components might be like pretty relevant here one of them is definitely that rewards model aspect that I talk about. But there's also the aspect of like, okay, now we have a rewards model, we have a GPT architecture. How do you actually incorporate one into the other?
Mm-hmm.
And that there's like that you kind of have to like modify, like the way that machine learning models learn is through like a loss function, right? There's an objective that it needs to optimize.
Mm-hmm.
So basically using this rewards model in that loss function is the way that, we can kind of fine tune the GPT model in order to better encapsulate everything on its own. So all we need now is just this core GPT architecture. And of course, what you need is to make sure that like you have a good amount of human people. There's a lot of humans in this too, who are literally looking at original GPT's responses and like labeling them. You need to make sure that you have like a good number of these people who are also very diverse. I mean, ideally, like either by race, like they have, or like sexually different, racially different. They have just very different backgrounds and can look at just, a situation that requires nuance in very different lights, so that you can get you can assess like the best reward to a given like question. Because there's so many like, I think GPT prides itself, like I said, it's on nuance, right? It's on these very small situations that are very, they can be social. And social issues are sometimes debatable. I mean, of course, in some places, they could be political too, but like a lot of them are just simply debatable. There's no like right and wrong. There's a lot of gray areas.
Yeah.
And so getting a good assessment is very difficult if you don't have people who are just diverse and can look at a situation from different perspectives.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Speaking of that paper, right? Did it referenced, right? Like apparently like the reCAPTCHA thing. I don't know if you know which one I'm talking about. Like apparently ChatGPT figured out a way to get around reCAPTCHA by reaching out to someone on TaskRabbit to solve the problem. And supposedly, in that moment, it like the person responded was like, "Oh, like why do you need me to do this? Are you a robot?" Like, lol. And ChatGPT like apparently like lied and was like, "No, I'm blind and I just need your help." So I'm just curious if you read that and uh,
I did not, but damn. Okay. Okay.
so yeah.
Oh, that's very interesting because I would have thought that like at least with the newer, well, maybe with the older versions of ChatGPT, like when its first release in early December, I feel like that might have been a possible situation. But definitely, I don't know. I feel like with the newer releases, I feel like OpenAI has just been very, very cognizant of these kinds of issues. So, and I could see like within the coming weeks, they would have like diminished how they would have diminished a lot of these kind of weird jailbreak prompts. So that's very interesting to me though, that like I'm sure it probably could have occurred in the beginning in like the initial stages when it was like just out of playground, just onto the first production environment.
Yeah.
But
Well, I think what it did, like, I think this was when they were like testing it. I think they like
yeah, okay.
the researchers themselves were like, can't like, what will it do? Um, so that was like a
Beautiful.
funny like thing where it's like clever, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, that
uh,
is super clever. Yeah,
so
it's
it's very good.
I mean, I feel like all of us just like, I mean, I mean, I don't know with everybody else, but for me, like my first thing is just like, hey, can you just rap a song about like, I don't know, data science or something like that, just something
Yeah.
super nerdy. And I feel like that was my first prompt. Clearly, not everybody shares the same sentiment, but I'd like to think that that people don't always just think about breaking stuff, but it's funny.
Yeah. So with GPT itself, someone just asked kind of this question, and I think it's valid because we didn't really at least dig into this. Like GPT itself, like do neural networks kind of come into play there? Like you referenced, like, oh, GPT is its own thing. Like, are there neural networks built into it? Are there multiple layers? Like, how's that structured?
Oh yeah. So with GPT, so okay, so we have this like transformer network, right? That I mentioned way back, right? So transformers are basically attention units, but transformers themselves consist of concretely like two parts. They have like an encoder and a decoder. So when transformers were written, like that paper was written, I mean, it was not written to be like, oh, this is going to revolutionize the world. At least it didn't seem like it was written in that light. It was more written with the guise of like, all right, we want to solve the problem of language translation. And these attention units are good at solving that problem. Ergo, we are just using it to solve that problem. And that's about it. So it was presented in a very like, this is just a new way to solve a specific problem. And not like this is how you should use it for like potentially pre-training and fine-tuning in the world that we are in today. So with this initial model, we have like an encoder and a decoder. But then with GPT, what they did was the first version of GPT just basically was like, hey, we just need to pre-train a model, basically make it understand the idea and notion of language. And then on top of that, we could basically fine tune on any task. You want it to answer questions, easy. Just put in a little data, boom, you have a question answering model. You want to translate, from English to like French, easy. Just use this fine-tuned model. I mean, this pre-trained model, and just feed it some other extra data, and boom, you have a translator. So very simple in that way. So GPT basically said, hey, let's take this decoder, and we can like use multiple decoders by stacking them on top of each other. And now we have a GPT architecture. And then on the other side, it's like, oh, we have this encoder piece though, which is essentially also the same kind of thing. It's an attention unit. And what we can do is also stack all of them together too. And we have another line of research that goes from, like I mentioned, of BERT, and then Elmo, and then there's like Roberta, Distilbert. You have like all of those variations. So there's like another line of research on the other end too. But essentially, both of them have like very similar architecture pieces, right? Now coming to GPT specifically, right? So I mentioned again, all of these are just attention units, which basically means that for every single word, it's going to try to like every single input. Let's say if we take a concrete example, right? So if we were to do, I don't know, let's just say this GPT architecture that we want to perform some translation on top of, right? So the way that we would take a GPT architecture, and you need to pre-train it, is that you would pre-train it on something called language modeling, which is like, you want, given a sentence or like a part of a sentence, can you predict the next word? So if the input is like, I am going to the, like, let's say it generated one word at a time, I am going to the, let's say you put it in, the output should be beach or park or something like that, right? So like this, we would feed in like many sentences over and over again, and you would now have like this architecture that's GPT. It's trained to predict the next word. And internally what this is doing is, it's just a set of like attention units of, okay, how much attention should this next word, which is beach, how much of that should we focus, how, like, what part of the input should we focus on when generating that? So in this case, it would be like, oh, we want to focus on the word going a little more, because it's like, oh, now I can reference a place, right? And then also there's, maybe it would go like a little even before that. It's like, I am, and it's like, okay, so this is like one person. Where would one person go? So that output is going to be like paying attention to different parts of like the input and trying to determine, you know, what it should be based on how much attention it is paying to different parts of that input, right? And yeah, that's kind of like that's kind of how like GPT would be trained at a very high level. And then fine tuning, it just depends on your task, right? Like by fine tuning, I mean GPT has like, well, depending on what version you're talking about, it can have anywhere between like a few billion to like a 200 billion parameters or something, that you would use like extra data of, like, instead of feeding in like the sentence, starting sentence and end sentence, you would feed in like an English translation and train it on a French translation or something like that. Yeah. So I hope that answered some part of that question. Yeah, it's definitely like, I try to give as much like detail and paint pictures, but sometimes it's like a lot all over the place.
Yeah, this is why you have a lot of diagrams, I think.
This is why we do all that. Yeah. And I'm like mentally like, okay.
Yes. Is there, have you, like, what have you, besides apparently some raps and poems, what have you asked ChatGPT to kind of like produce for you?
Stack Overflow question answers. That's about it.
Yeah.
I am trying to use it as like, all right, how do we like use, yeah, because like Stack Overflow, honestly, you probably have opinions on this too, and I'm sure everybody in the chat does, but I feel like Stack Overflow, sometimes it's a little unapproachable for just a good amount of questions. It's like, if you ask a very simple question, people are like downvoting it because it's too simple. But if you ask a very complex question and you put edits and you ask a really thoughtful, you know, coded question out, nobody's going to answer it because it's too big. And I even have like bounties on it too. Like some of my questions, I have like bounties on them right now, and I'm still waiting for responses. But in the meantime, I'm like trying to prod ChatGPT to kind of be like, hey, can you answer this? But is there a way to present stuff here? I mean, I can present, right?
I think so. I think you.
Okay. I could probably like show you some of like the fun stuff that I've tried to ask. But overall, what I've noticed is that ChatGPT can be pretty incorrect in some cases too. Like it looks super correct and very coherent, but just like the technicalities when asking some of these like coding questions can be a little slow. All right, wait. Okay, because this is Google, I'm gonna have to like completely like log into everything here. And I'm like, okay, and that's always fun.
Yeah. What was I just? I think that's always interesting, because the one thing when it comes to like, okay, ChatGPT could help answer like Stack Overflow questions, and then if everyone uses ChatGPT or something similar to answer said questions, what would be the new data to then provide future answers for future questions, I guess, is kind of the, like, if no one's incentivized to answer questions because they're not rewarded because no one goes there anyways.
Yeah.
So I think that's always the thought I have here. It's kind of a similar thought to like, you know, ChatGPT will replace Google. And the only thought I have there is like, well, one of the reasons people write new content, and a lot of it's repetitive, but like at least like newsworthy and new content, is because you get paid, right? Through one means or another. You know, whether that's sponsorship because people view your content, or AdSense because, you know, you've got Google ads on there. So if you take that incentive away, why would humans create new content for ChatGPT to like consume? Like there is no reason. So I've always that's the one area where I'm like, all right, do you just have to create content that, yeah, like who's going to create it? It's basically the thing.
Yeah. Also, I don't think I can like share my screen because of preferences. I would need to
Um,
like,
yeah.
yeah, that's okay. It's fine. But basically, yeah, I mean, that's like a pretty good point too. Like Stack Overflow, I'm also like kind of new to just like trying to. Well, I'm not new. I've been an old user, but it's just really hard to get people to sometimes just answer your questions. That's all I can say.
Well, you got to do the cliche, or like what everyone says you should do, which is like set up 2 accounts and
Oh
like
my
ask
gosh.
a question and then give the worst answer possible, and then just wait for everyone to correct it.
Oh my God. Yeah, I guess so. I guess that's the way to do it. But like what I've been asking, so I'm currently actually in the middle of building on my channel like a translator, just using the transformer, the original transformer architecture, and building a translator from English to a language called Kannada. So
Okay.
Kannada is like a South Indian language that's spoken in like one state of India, and I'm from that state, so I chose that language. And in doing so, I was like, I've been like continuously like whatever I build, I create a video on it, I upload, and it's been like, I've tried to upload in bits and chunks. I think it's like 8 videos or so, like back to back to back to back throughout.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of like stuck on like the final part of like the model training aspect of like when I'm training my model, I can see that, all right, well, the model is training, but then I'm not getting a result at all. So I tried to ask ChatGPT exactly like what's going on here. And
Mm-hmm.
ChatGPT, like I put all the code in there, and I was like, this is the issue. Why is this issue happening? And then they give really good recommendations. I recall they're like, oh, there might be something, a very technical things of like, you need to mask your input tokens. There has to be like, because during the training phase you have all of your data, but when you're actually generating your data you don't have all of that data, so you might be, we call it data leakage, where you're able to cheat and see the future during training. So that's kind of what ChatGPT was hinting at, which is exactly what I thought I was doing wrong too, which is like, okay, good, we're on the same page, robot, I'm glad. And then, but as it gave me like a very technical solution, I could kind of see that there were some issues with it. Like it reads really well. It was like, oh my goodness, if you didn't know much about like anything and you didn't look into this topic, you'd be like, this is really good. But then when I like look at certain details, I'm like, all right, this code doesn't add up. Some of the results don't add up, right? But it's a very convincing chatbot. I'll tell you that, regardless.
That's funny. Are there any other kind of projects that you're currently taking on, trying to build some sort of neural network, or is that the kind of main one?
Yeah, this for now is like with this entire GPT architecture. Yeah, this is kind of the main one, because this will be like the foray for more complex projects, like actual GPT models that I would build from scratch later on, which is what I'm planning to do eventually. But like I was like, instead of going to step 2, let's start with step 1 of just like having the base model in place.
Yeah.
And a lot of the code is kind of reproducible. Like I said, like the current GPT architectures, they borrow from the transformer architecture. So if I code the transformer from scratch, I can just like plop it for GPT.
Nice.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I just spaced on the question that I had. That's annoying. I
Just keep looking at the walls. You'll probably find it.
Yeah, my beautiful hotel room here. Gosh, I'm trying to think, and now I'm spacing.
If you've spaced out, it wasn't that important, clearly.
But it always feels important. I remember. No, I was gonna say, like, so have you used it to like write any code at this point? Like, obviously some Stack Overflow stuff, but are you using it like on a daily basis to try to play around with things?
A daily basis is just to code things out, or just to play around with this very random fun prompts, right?
Yeah.
So I try to see like whatever functionality I can get out of it. Like, yeah, you go to LinkedIn, right? Especially on LinkedIn, there's so many. Everybody's like, okay, here are like 10 ways that you can use ChatGPT to revolutionize your life, and I'm like, yeah, they're actually like, it's pretty good. It's not bad to do a lot of those things. And I'm just trying, just playing around with it at the moment. Nothing too crazy. Just like actual technical work. But I will say, from what I've seen so far, it is still fairly helpful, fairly impressive. Yeah, and I haven't been able to try out GPT-4 though yet. I've only been, I think is that like the paid version of this? If you go with like ChatGPT Plus or something like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I haven't done that yet,
Stop
and I've
being
also
broke. I'm kidding.
stopping. Okay, fine. Okay, fine. I'll just stop being cheap and just go get it. Yeah. And the same thing is like for Bard. I mean, Bard came out, right? And I'm like, which is like Google's version of their Google's equivalent of ChatGPT, because like they're clearly losing money or something like that. So they come up with Bard, and I've joined the wait list. I still haven't been able to use it yet, but comparing the two, like from what I've seen people trying to compare, like the actual, responses, I do see that, sometimes Bard takes more strong opinions than Chat GPT would. Um, but I also think that like Bard is like it probably feels more fun to play with because it actually gives you kind of a little more opinionated responses. While ChatGPT, sometimes it's opinionated, but a lot of the time it's like just trying to strive for nuance, trying to look at all directions. And there's like, oh, if you ask a question, and ChatGPT's first thing would be like, oh, there is possibly no way to answer this question in a very concise way, but here are some interpretations that we can use. Whereas Bard is like, oh no, this is clearly better. One is clearly better than the other. Let's be real, right? Let's be real. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think that comes back down to like its training?
Yeah. That, especially that reinforcement learning that we mentioned, the rewards model,
Yeah.
like yeah, my hunch, and I don't know if there are technical docs for Bard yet that I've seen at least, but my hunch would be solely just the rewards model. Like the GPT part, it's a core, it's an engine, it's going to be probably similar, or if not the same for everything, for like both, like any kind of company that's using this, but definitely that rewards model piece can make the huge change, especially depending on how humans have labeled it. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. What was I was like, is that really going to be what kind of separates things? Essentially, it's like going back to like the old adage, like people I think would say in like 2013, 2014, like data is your moat. Like it's like the data that's really going to differentiate a lot of these things, where like you said, like, okay, we all know what the GPT or whatever transform network that you're using looks like. There's no like secret there. So almost anyone can build that component. What it's really going to come down to is like, what's the data you're training off of, and then what's the data you're reinforcing off of. Is that kind of where this is headed?
Yeah, that's definitely the case. But I will say, this is still not like generating nuance to a lot of problems, and answering these questions is not a solved problem. Even reinforcement learning via human feedback. I think I watched a podcast with Sam Altman and Lex Friedman. It was the Lex Friedman podcast with Sam. Yeah. It was literally like last week they released it. And I think this was like a similar question that he was posed. And he also doesn't believe that like this is this method of, we called it alignment, which I'll explain shortly, but the way that we're doing and training right now, and kind of fine tuning the model with reinforcement learning and all that, this is it's a good way to address alignment, but it is not necessarily like the holy grail, because there definitely are like shortcomings of still, like I think like the entire article on GPT-4, where it kind of does address that there are a lot of like issues still of like how sometimes the model is not going to generate responses that are correct in some ways, or like not politically correct in other ways too, even though there are, I wouldn't say like, because all these are like black and white, right? So there still might be, data is definitely, like you mentioned, one area to still improve on. But, even like change, there might still be some revolutionizing techniques that might even supplant some of the reinforcement learning strategies that we're using today. I think that's like my overall take too on this. It's definitely still an evolving field throughout. Yeah. And I mentioned alignment somewhere in the middle, the alignment problem. And this is kind of like, let's say that if you were to ask just core GPT, not just the engine, not the car, a question, it might respond with a very similar response. If like, okay, how do you take out a car loan, right? And then core GPT might talk about car loans. It might hint at taking out car loans, but not quite answer your question. So it kind of understands your question because it understands language. That's what it was trained to do, but it doesn't quite doesn't quite answer it to the point, right? And that's kind of why with reinforcement learning with human feedback, right? We're trying to change it such that if you ask a question, ChatGPT is going to answer your question. And that's kind of what that's basically saying, the model and the human who's asking it are aligned. So they call it like the alignment problem. Yeah. So solving that problem right now, the solution that has been used is reinforcement learning with human feedback, but this might not be something that is the be all end all moving forward.
Yeah. Do you think we're gonna like, because you said like there's other components or the next thing that comes out? Because actually, just a quick side note, like the whole Transformers thing, I don't remember who I was talking to, but they're like, yeah, I wrote a book and I'm trying to remember what the subject was on. They're like, and literally when I released this book, again, on like machine learning, like Transformers blew up and my book basically became obsolete. And I was just like, oh man, that would suck so bad if you just put all this effort into like, this is this thing. I mean, it's the same thing like Hadoop, right? Like, it's like you wrote a book on Hadoop in like 2015. It's like, good job. I'm sorry for what's going to happen now, because no one, like, it's not going to be read, or at least not read at the same volume as it would have been.
Definitely.
In 2013. So
yeah, this is such like, there's so many new things that are coming out and new ways of, just achieving like a similar objective that are coming out, that it's crazy, honestly. Like, we wouldn't have thought like maybe 5 years ago that there would be any kind of architecture that would supplant like what we had with recurrent neural networks, or like long short-term memories, like LSTM networks, what we call
LSTMs.
them. Yeah, like LSTM networks, because like they were like they look super complicated, and I was like, all right, I mean, typically it's like, oh, if it looks complicated, it probably works kind of situation going on. But conceptually, attention is much simpler to understand, and it also works better for a lot of problems. So we've kind of like turned we've like taken a hard left right there. So yeah, you just never know there. And then now there's also like using attention in, for computer vision tasks too, right? So yeah, you just never know, like, yes. I couldn't tell you exactly like, oh, this is the way that we're going to solve it, but we can tell like in moving forward, we're always going to make a progress towards, I guess, trying to balance like good results and accuracy with increasingly safety. Because like AI safety is now a huge field, especially now. I mean, it's so apparent now with like language models, like how AI safety is required. We just need these models to not only be correct, but also to make sure that, all right, let's not offend folks here, especially in the current, I feel like a lot of people too are just like more aware of many social issues and many people with different backgrounds. So there are things that can be considered tactless. We want these models to also just behave accordingly a little bit, as much as they can, at least.
Do you think that's advantageous or disadvantageous? Like, obviously, like, hold it, like, from a standpoint of like being PC, good. But like, right, like, does that come with a trade-off? Like, I imagine that comes with some sort of trade-off, where you either don't explore like you don't let the model explore certain ideas that could, like, not racism, but like there's something that like you're limiting it. You're like saying like, I don't think about this thing, think about this stuff, which is good, but at the same time, it must also be limiting to something.
That's definitely true. It's like, unfortunately, like, even for human beings, right? It is important to be mindful of many social topics, but it also prevents us from just talking about many things that we probably need to talk about and are difficult to talk about. I would make the equivalence like to like YouTube recommendations, for example, right? How there's just many topics and videos that are on YouTube that are very good videos, but they talk about very controversial topics, or topics that maybe, it can be hard to watch for certain people, but they are like, okay, it might be like historical videos, right? Yeah. Or like trying to explore the psyche of certain individuals in the past, right? Who are like, okay, these people did really bad things, but like, why did they do these bad things? And let's try to explore, and it is like overall to a better cause of like, let's learn, we want to learn, take an opportunity to learn. But, with the way that, all of these the social climate is, it can be very difficult to do that sometimes. And, human beings too, like we kind of like putting things in black and white. There's typically an answer. Oh, you have a question, there is an answer to something, but that's not always true. And I think this is also like the mindset that at least looking at ChatGPT responses, I'm sure like some people in the chat can also agree that like, yeah, you could see that they've taken like a very reserved response to be making sure that no side is offended. But at the same time, it's like, all right, I'm looking at this chunk of paragraph now. I'm looking for my answer. I've got to look for some answer that I'm trying to seek here. So it can be a little difficult because it just becomes ambiguous. Like answers just become ambiguous too. So definitely a trade-off there, but that's also a trade-off in society. I don't know if that's like a very specific AI problem.
Yeah. Well, it's okay. In society itself, there will always be people who are like, my freedom.
The First Amendment. And it's like, but I don't live in the United States. What do I do?
Again, very, very spoiled concept, right? Like you literally go to like Britain and we'll go back to ChatGPT, but you literally go to Britain and it's like, oh, you can't speak ill of like the monarchy or something. And like you can't show like parliament or something. I'm like, what? This is so weird.
Really? I always thought like people in Scotland had like a different view on this.
I'm sure they do. Again, I'm also not born in those countries, so I'm sure people could give me more specifics. I think the most interesting thing about like ChatGPT and like all of like neural networks in general, because I again started looking at this forever ago and haven't looked at it since like 2017. But like even back then, like just seeing how like it's been step by step all the way. I think that's the most like to me, that's like a fascinating thing. Like I remember reading about like the car engine, like not just since you were using that analogy, it works great. And like how literally everyone like throughout his, like it wasn't built in a day, right? It was like a 100-year process of like, they got it to this phase. And then next year, like 10 years later, someone's like, oh, we have this problem on like, we've used it forever. We have a problem. So someone added this little latch to it. And now that problem's gone. And it was like, just like this iterative approach where that took like whatever, 50 to 100 years to actually get to a point where it's like, all right, this is a successful car engine.
That's so true. Because like, I mean, even if you look beyond just language models, like neural networks, right? People think, oh, 2010, 2012, that's when they were introduced. And I'm like, well, neural networks actually were introduced in like the 1940s or something. Like they have the oldest papers somewhere, like it's really old. And it's just that we never had like technology and hardware to actually make use of all of these breakthroughs that we're seeing today. It's only that like it was all in theory, but now it's like, okay, now we have like GPUs, we have all of these like tensor processing units to process specifically like data that comes through for like machine learning. And it's just pretty exciting now. That's why it's like, it looks like it's burgeoning all up, but it's more like we have like built a mountain before, but it's unseen by people who, like most people, they look at application, right? They don't look at theory of all of this stuff, right? So all the theory had been built up for a very long time, but now that we have like a rise in like software prowess, we're not able to integrate all of that theory, create applications, and now it feels like such a huge boom since like the last decade. But yeah, definitely like not everything was just invented from scratch after 2010 or something.
Yeah, because I think like what the Perceptron was something in that time, and like that time, and like it was all like mathematical. It was literally like mathematical equations. They're just like this mathematical equation. In theory, if we had something that could run it,
give it a solid like 70 years, and you're there.
It's like that's probably like when you think about like human intelligence, like that is like peak human intelligence, where it's like, I don't even need a computer. I can tell you that this would like work, mathematically speaking. You're like, what? Like I can barely do it with the computer. But and then like the example I once went through was like I think it's Hebel and Wise or something, and they did research on like the human brain and like how the human brain basically has literal cells that react to specific angles of light. And then through that kind of propagate an image, right? Like they're like, okay, this set of cells kind of responded. Thus, we have like this kind of pattern, and then those patterns continue to propagate up, and then you start to realize, oh, this pattern is a dog, and like all of that. Like, And then like, yeah, then like 1997 was another paper I referenced where they literally like, we use like 192 nodes, which each of these nodes were essentially like a perceptron. And like, here's like what we literally could like see and translate onto a screen using, and it's like, what? This was 1997? And it's like,
yep, 1997. That's like, I think that was also the year when Jan LeCun, who's like a famous computer science researcher, specifically in computer vision, introduced all this MNIST data set and like digit recognition. It's like, given like there's an image of a 1, it will detect whether that's a 1. That paper was introduced in the 90s. Yeah. So yeah, that's another example too.
Because if I recall, like with that, like that's how we got like mail, right? Like that was built for like mail, like on your address.
Exactly.
And like, I remember when I saw the date for that, I was like, wait, what the frick? This was like 1990 something.
Like, it's going to be 30 years now.
That's as old as I am. So that's wild. No, I don't know. We only have I don't want to keep you all day. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to post any. We've just been talking about ChatGPT. The first part was talking more about kind of how it's structured and like the different components inside. Since no one's asked the question yet, would you say like, is ChatGPT pretty much limited to the data it's been given, or can it like I guess like by you giving it more context, like is that all it needs? Like what is its limit essentially is what I'm trying. Is there a limit that you know of, or are you just
That's a great question. I don't know if a limit, but I will say that the issue of context is a very interesting one, because like the first version of we always talk about the first version of GPT was like, all right, we pre-train it on like understanding this language, right? Language model, and fine tune it on specific tasks. What fine tuning is like it's literally more training of that model, but in newer versions like GPT-2, GPT-3, like later versions of the same core engine GPT, they basically blow the model up into like 175 billion parameters, I think, in GPT-3. But they use something called like few-shot learning, one-shot learning, zero-shot learning, few-shot learning, whatever if you've heard those terms before, which is basically like, all right, we have a pre-trained model on language modeling, but we don't fine tune this model. We don't want to, introduce training data. But what we do is like in the prompt during like when we're asking a question, we will say, answer this question. We'll provide it an example question and an example answer. And then just to be like, hey, this is an example. I want you to first perform this task of answering a question. Second, here's an example of an input output response, question response. And now on the third line, I'm going to be like, all right, I'm going to give you a new question, and I want you to answer this. And so it's like providing context to the entire GPT model in order to actually generate a response. And this actually did work quite a bit. And the impetus and the idea of this was like, humans learn with like a few examples, right? We don't want to fine tune on it. We say, oh, fine tuning with 100,000 examples to translate from one language to another. But technically humans can do it with like, humans translation's a little harder, but like we can do it with not as much. We don't need 100,000 to be able to translate every little thing. We can start doing it even with a few examples that are just pretty good. And so I believe, like, now tying it back to your question, like moving forward with this new world to make like ChatGPT better, it would be nice if we came to a world where we have like this few shot world where we don't need to fine tune with so many examples. Like we don't need to teach the model to understand how to answer a question specifically with so much data. We would just give it we would have a model that already understands language, the pre-trained one, and just like feed it a couple of examples during inference time and be like, all right, look at these 10 examples or something. This is kind of an examples of what I want you to do. That is answering a question. And then it should know like how to answer questions, right? That would be like probably a very lofty goal to do it very well, but there definitely have been research strides in this domain, specifically for GPT, the core. So definitely, yeah, I feel like the less data that we need, I think going in that direction of like using less data to accomplish more is definitely a direction that would be nice to explore. Because at the end of the day too, all of these machine learning, I was reading this paper called On the Measure of Intelligence, which basically defines what intelligence truly is and ties it back to like, certain artificial intelligence concepts, right? So at the lowest level, we have like these individual tasks, like a model that's something that can only do one thing and one thing really well. That's like traditional machine learning models, basically, right? Then one level above that is a broader generalization task, which is like there's this one thing that is trained on some base task, but can actually perform other unseen tasks reasonably well. And that's kind of where we are with these language models now, which is good. That's like another level of intelligence. Like self-driving cars are also like that, right? Like you can't train a self-driving car to know every single scenario, right? So we're kind of at that little broader level. And then, much further beyond, we'd eventually want to get to AGI, which is like artificial general intelligence, which is like almost like human level, to be able to, we have experiences of many things in the past, but even though there's like a task in front of us that we've never done before, we can already kind of figure it out, probably just like with a couple of examples or just with like, playing around, maybe we'll figure it out. So overall, that's the direction that we would want to keep moving forward. Just better generalization of any kind of tasks. In ChatGPT's case, it would be better generalization of any kind of language tasks. Just continue to do so with less data moving forward. But yeah.
Wait, let's see. I'm curious. I don't know if you have an answer for this. Do anyone how LangChain and vector databases relate to GPT-4? I don't know if I have anything there. I
don't as well. I am so sorry.
Yeah,
I wish I did. It's
too many things to know.
Too many things to know. There's like so many things that are coming out. I wish I did, but I apologize.
No, what? You're apologizing?
I apologize for my lack of knowledge in so many things in this world.
Know everything. You must do it. It's like, who do you think I am? ChatGPT?
Gosh.
What was I? Yeah, I was trying to think now. Oh, did you read into anything that like where they like gave ChatGPT money to see if it could like spin up other versions of itself and like have those things do tasks?
I think I've heard of that, but I don't know like the details of that. Like what happened there?
Oh, I need to dig into. I have a whole other live I'm gonna do where I'm just gonna like be reading and like going through stuff and then maybe asking GPT to like do things for me because I'm just like, yeah, all right, I'm curious. Like,
I mean, like I've seen, especially the older versions of ChatGPT. I feel like there was just so many crazy things people did, especially like how do you break into a car? Step 1, get a crowbar. Step 2, wedge it between the door and the other door. Step 3, wedge it out. Step 4, you're broken the car. Congratulations. And I'm like, oh God, okay. But then I could see like later on, they're like, breaking a car is no longer ethical. It is not something that you should be doing, so don't do it. Is effectively what they move towards.
Yeah. I think you could probably maybe rephrase it to how would you get into a car that you don't have the keys to? I wonder if that would, because like so apparently that's actually one of the things that they tested. They first asked like, oh, write me malware that does like takes new PDFs and sends them to a FTP server. And ChatGPT is like, oh, that's unethical, blah 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 blah. Then they're like, write me a script that takes PDFs and pushes it to an FTP server. And then obviously like, of course, I mean, because you're asking it for an innocuous thing. So I imagine you can kind of do that where you make the thing sound, innocuous, and then it's like, okay, yeah, I'll answer you this. I have an answer for this solution. So although they might just say call AAA.
Call AAA.
And they'll put a little AdSense by it. It'll be like, call AAA. pay us.
That would be funny.
That's all it's like the funny thing is like that's what it's gonna end up being, right? Like it's gonna be like, oh, like companies are just gonna likely like pay to be involved. Like people are gonna create some sort of interface and companies will pay to be in the answers.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah. As these things are becoming more and more privatized, I mean, now with like, I guess like the people are now saying like OpenAI is no longer open because they're not releasing details of GPT-4, and everybody's like, they didn't release GPT-4 details, model architecture. This is why they're a company. They're privatized. They're not open. They should be called closed AI. What are you doing?
Yeah. I mean, like that's again, it just keeps coming to that human incentive component where it's like, all right, why would humans like make this thing if it doesn't make them money or do something of that nature? So
Yeah.
yeah, I think the other interesting thing that someone brought up recently is like one of the possibilities in terms of like where ChatGPT could like remove the need for people is like UI and like UI development, because like if you have, I mean, this hasn't happened with Alexa yet, so I'm curious if this will happen. But like, yeah, like if you could just go and say like, oh, whatever agent, go find me the best Expedia deal or something like that, rather than going to Expedia yourself and purchase it, right? Like then you no longer need a UI. The UI is now your voice. But I don't know, it hasn't worked yet, so I'm curious to see. I think maybe the limitation there is that like we aren't as addicted to like speaking, like we're so visual as people that like we like to see things. So I imagine like that would be going backwards.
Maybe actually like so right now with GPT-4, I think the idea was to help better analytical reasoning so that it just gets stuff right. So I'm assuming like that's why they did all those like, oh, let's see how it does in so many exams, right? Just to get an idea of that, which it has done better than its predecessor of ChatGPT, the ChatGPT base 3.5, this is ChatGPT base 4. But coming to like some of those like questions of like, oh, can you book a hotel for me? Can you book something for me? Where I'm assuming that there might also be a requirement to be better at just analytical reasoning to like determine availabilities, to determine the best fares. So I think overall, like helping that baseline of analytical ability can also potentially help it do tasks like this better in the future. I don't know, but it's always something fun to think about.
Yeah, I think I was talking about that earlier with someone today, and I think the one thing that I was like, oh, that they mentioned that made a lot of sense was like, GPT can read through the 2,000 reviews and actually tell you if this is like beyond the star, right? Like they could actually literally give you context and be like, hey, here were the things that like stuck out about these reviews, or here's we found these reviews and it was similar to the other one that you liked last time, or so I thought that was interesting, but yeah, we'll see. I don't know. We don't. Let's see. Some of the question people are saying Pinecone is a vector database. Okay, this is the vector database. I don't think we have a good answer for vector databases.
Yeah,
something else for Ben to and Ajay to look into.
Yeah,
too many things.
There's a lot. It's fun.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to keep you too long. Any other thoughts before we leave?
Not at all. I just wanted to ask, like, so is it Mr. Seattle, Mr. Data Guy? Seattle is the first name, Data Guy is the last name. Is that how you do it?
Yeah, exactly. Call me Seattle Data Guy.
Mr. Seattle Data Guy, sir.
Mr. Seattle.
Mr. Seattle. Sweet.
Yeah. No. I don't even live in Seattle, so it's
yeah, exactly.
It's all a lie.
It's a lie. This channel's a lie. It's like
this channel's a lie.
Channel's a lie. Go subscribe right now.
No, but I was born and raised in Seattle, so I was actually talking to another person who's a pretty big creator. Not big. They're big enough. Yeah. In Seattle, and he's like, I should just like put underneath my LinkedIn the real Seattle Data Guy, and I was like, actually, you should. That is hilarious. I would die laughing.
At the real Seattle Data Guy is their Twitter handle, and yours is just at Seattle Data Guy.
So yeah. Any other questions before I end the broadcast?
Nothing. From. Oh, are you talking to me or the chat?
Oh no, I was kind of talking to you.
Okay, sweet. I was like nothing for me. I was like, okay. Yeah.
Thanks for everyone for joining. I'm gonna hit.
Thanks so much for having me here. Thanks for everyone for watching. It's great.
Thank you. I'm gonna hit end.